The retrieval of the past is a great challenge. And we are in Ireland something of a secretive people. And because of this almost universal reluctance to talk about the crisis, it suffered an early death in the collective memory. The famine to many would be inevitable because the build-up from, shall we say, 1800 to 1845 was one of a steadily rising population with a declining economy. In the 19th century, there were really three Skibbereens. There was the town before the famine, there was the Skibbereen during the crisis, and then there was post-famine. As in the countryside, the disparity between the haves and have-nots was very wide indeed. The very poor occupied laneways off the main streets. Some of them still survive there, the lanes. And poverty was very marked among the have-nots. But then so was charity, because you had no welfare state. Any charity had to come from voluntary efforts around. And I suppose the first act of welfare by the British government was the building of the Workhouse in Skibbereen, just on the eve of the famine.
Skibbereen was always a sort of a market town, and still is. You know, it's a market town with a big hinterland. The area was densely populated. The population of the town was, 4,700. The same urban areas now less than 2,000. In 1841 there were 500 baptisms in the cathedral here. Now if there's 50 in a year, it's as much as there would be. Famine for the people of this area was nothing new. Every couple of years there was local or regionalised famines, but they were only lasted for 1 year. There was hardship for a year, then they'd come out of it. The crop would fail for some reason. In 1817 there was a particularly bad famine here. In 1821-22 there was a particularly bad famine here. That one actually, there was quite a number of deaths in the southwest area. When you take it that after the famine of 1741, when 250,000 people died, the population rose again, and in say 1755, the population of Ireland was about 2.4 million. By 1845, it was nearly 8.5 million. I mean, that was the most extraordinary population explosion in any terms, no matter what yardstick you use, There was a disaster waiting to happen, there's no doubt about that, with that sort of growth.
Well, Skibbereen becomes associated with the famine, partly because the famine is very bad in Skibbereen very early on. It's one of the first places that the sheer poverty of this undergirding of the social structure becomes apparent in. Skibbereen, West Cork in general, I would say, but Skibbereen certainly, but also you have in Skibbereen, you have a very active local doctor, Dr. O'Donovan. You have the Reverend Trail, of course, but you also have other both Anglican and Catholic clergymen who are very concerned about what's happening, who write the London Times, which is the key organ of circulation of information in England, and particularly among the ruling classes. And so information about Skibbereen is getting across specifically to England from late 1846. And then a dramatic thing happened. The Illustrated London News was the main source of pictorial images for the English middle class. And they said, let's send somebody over to see what it's really like. And they selected James Mahoney, who was also an illustrator, not simply a reporter. And it was from the middle of February that the illustrations from Mahoney began appearing in the Illustrated London News. And they hit, I think, the English psyche, the emotions of readers in a way that descriptions and letters in newspapers and so on didn't. And English public opinion really sits up suddenly and says, my God, something terrible is happening there. So it has enormous impact at precisely that time on charity, from private charity, from England for Ireland. But there was a good collection throughout most of England in March of 47, thanks to the name of Skibbereen. You had to just say Skibbereen, and this resounded as the graphics came up immediately in front of your face, and you put your hand in your pocket and you contributed. So, in a sense, the whole of Ireland benefits from the iconic status of Skibbereen as the epicentre of horror.
Well, I guess a good place to start would be the potato, which would have been the main pre-famine diet. We did this here to illustrate it because most kids can't comprehend the size of the quantities that they ate at the time. But 55 pounds of potatoes was, believe it or not, the consumption for a family for a day. It's estimated a man ate about 14 pounds of potatoes, a woman about 11 pounds, and then each child about 5 pounds. The sheer volume of it is amazing. But it was a very nutritious food because with a little bit of buttermilk, it was a complete food. And studies have shown that it was a very healthy diet and it was a complete diet. Earlier on, there was a lot of different varieties of potato, black, apple and cup, lots of different varieties. But as the years went on and the subdivision kept going on, this potato emerged as the winner, the lumper potato, because it was abundant. It was a very good cropper. Problem was it was very, very high in starch and unfortunately very susceptible to blight.
Blight had begun in the northeast of the United States in 1843, and it was carried across the Atlantic on potatoes that were being exported to Europe. Blight appeared in many Western European countries, gradually spread to Ireland, and was first detected in early September of 1845. So in this first year, 1845, we had a partial failure of the potato crop. Blight reappeared in the following year, 1846, and on this occasion there was a complete failure of the crop, by which we mean about 90% of the crop was affected. In the following year, 1847, which ironically in Ireland is known as Black 47, blight did not appear. But because so little seed had been planted, the production in 1847 was far below normal output. Blight reappeared in 1848, again bringing about a complete failure of the crop, and finally there was a partial failure in 1849. So what we have here is a situation where you have 5 years, if you like, of successive crop failures. And it was this repeated nature, this recurring nature of failure that really brought about the situation we describe as the Great Famine.
The countryside then would be totally different to what it is now. Rural society in the 19th century was rigid, if you like. At the top of the range, you had, of course, the landlord or his agent. Then you had the strong farmer. Then you had the medium tenant farmer. And then the bottom of the pile was the cottier or cabin dweller. And they were dotted all over the place. And they were the class who were never to return after the famine. They were wiped out totally. They never came back, the cottiers or the cabin dwellers. It was a massive transformation of the landscape, more so outside the towns.
The system of land ownership in Ireland was multi-layered, with lots of layers of middlemen and so on between the landless labourer, which would have been at the very bottom, and then the landlord, which would have been at the very top. This is an actual an account from the Devon Commission, and you see here the landless labourer is paying 40 shillings to the tenant farmer, who then pays 32 shillings to the middleman. But by the time it gets up to the landlord, it's just 3 shillings. So it's quite often this misconception that there was these huge fat landlords, but this was the way it went, and it was so skewed in that those who could least afford to pay ended up paying the most.
the country was not bereft of food. Food was available to those who had the money to buy it. There was bread being baked in the towns. The cabin dweller needed one amount of currency, which was vital to him, and that was the annual rent to the landlord. And to meet that, he raised a pig. The pig accommodated in the cabin was not to be killed for the cabin dwellers. It was to be sold when fat. And a fat pig could fetch £1 at the time. And you possibly needed £2 a year to pay the rent for the amount of land you were occupying with the cabin. That would be the main currency transaction conducted by a cabin dweller. Estimated at the time, an income of about £8 a year enabled a cabin family to survive, with, of course, the potatoes. They did get the potato patch, all right.
Well, Irish society before 1845 was very strange in some ways, because the number of agricultural labourers, of landless labourers or labourers who had acres, say roughly an acre maybe, on which they grew their potatoes, that was what they lived on. They were paid in land by either stronger farmers or by landlords, so they had very little cash income. So they were wholly dependent on the potato, effectively. They might have a pig which they would sell, and that would do for whatever little ready money they might have. But the pig was dependent on the potato as well. So the potato was crucial to survival of a growing proportion of the Irish population. There might have been maybe 4 million people who were largely dependent on the potato, maybe 3 million wholly dependent on the potato. So it was an expanding society in population terms, but on a very precarious base. Having said that, the yield of the potato varied less than the yield of grain crops, for instance. So it was not irrational or illogical to rely on the potato. It was very nutritious, that's often overlooked, and you could feed far more people on an acre of potatoes than you could on an acre of grain. So the Irish were not irrational, in a sense, relying on the potato as their core life-giving crop.
Ireland had no system of looking after its poor. So what happened was, just for administrative purposes, the country was divided into 130 areas. That was 130 union areas. Skibbereen was one of them. And in Skibbereen, a workhouse was built. It was actually one of the first that was opened. The Skibbereen Union area covered big hinterland, you know, down to Union Hall, Glendore. It was West Carby, really, you know. It was, while the population of Skibbereen was, 4,700, the population of the Union area was 105,500. So it was a big area. In the Union area, you know, Union Hall, Rosscarbery, up to Reenascreena, and all the way out west, you'd Skull, Ballyhob, Gullane. They were all initially included in the Skibbereen Workhouse Union area.
We are here in the middle of the workhouse in Skull. We must be able to imagine that in 1851 there were about 1,300 paupers here, and this was a large proportion of the ordinary population. In the three villages of Crookhaven, Skull and Ballyhob, there were about 1,500 people. So you could say that there were almost as many paupers in the workhouse as there were people in those three villages.
The government at the time, which is the Tory government, led by Sir Robert Peel, responded by purchasing £100,000 sterling worth of Indian corn or maize from the United States. And this grain was made available at cost price to people who were in need of food. Now, it was never the intention of the government to feed the Irish people directly. What they did was they imported this food, made it available at subsidised prices, and then created a system of public works to enable the people to earn money to purchase this food. Basically, these works were creating work for the sake of work. Very often it was building roads, throughout the winter of 1846 and into the spring of 1847. Some 700,000 people were engaged on these public works. Conditions were very, very difficult. Obviously, people were weak. They didn't have enough food. This took a great toll on the health of the people. The feeling at the time was that the government should not assist their people directly, should not provide free food. It was felt that such an intervention would demoralise the people, that it would make them too dependent on the state.
In some parts of the country, people speak of the famine roads being foolish works and going from nowhere to nowhere. And some of them were all right, they were just there to give employment to the poor. But as far as I can see anyway around Pleasant Peninsula, the roads were useful enough. I know some of them were never finished, and the grass grew over them, and there is a little boreen south of Ballyhub called Boreen Gloss, the green road, because the grass grew over it. I would say that it could have been useful enough if it were finished, but the roadworks were closed down quickly because the men were dying on them, and the Soup Kitchen Act came into force, which fed the people directly, and it was successful in feeding the people.
In late 1846, early 1847, workers on these public works are dying on the roadside or by the roadside. And of course, this creates a huge amount of negative publicity. It's extensively reported. There are many post-mortems into the bodies of people who have died. The invariable result is that people died from starvation. A huge amount of negative publicity is generated. This is reported in the British and in the Irish press. And the government really is forced into changing its policy to abandon public works. And instead, they decided to introduce soup kitchens, where food was distributed free of charge to people who were in need. By the summer of 1847, some 3 million people were being fed on a daily basis at these government soup kitchens. And this really was an outstanding administrative achievement. It really showed what could have been done had there been the will on the part of the government to persevere with this programme. Unfortunately, the government regarded the soup kitchens as a stopgap measure, simply to tide over the ending of one policy, which is the public works policy, until the introduction of a new policy, which was basically centred on the poor law. Essentially, what the government were doing with the ending of the soup kitchens and putting the focus on the poor law system was abandoning the Irish to dependency on themselves.
My name is Geary and I'm in Ireland to represent the story of the Choctaw donation during Black 47 to the Irish victims of Angor Timor, the Great Hunger. In 1847, they donated $170 in American money as a donation from the Choctaw, the children of the forest. The money was used to buy grain, not Indian corn, but grain, that was loaded on a ship called the Macedonian, that later in that year, in 1847, made port in Dunleary, Dublin Harbor. I don't know why the story resonates as much as it does. I have an idea why, but I don't know for sure. But, you know, looking at the totality of the famine, how horrifically immense that was. If you're talking about over 1 million people dying of famine and famine-related causes, another million cast adrift into the world as a diaspora. The Choctaw story, in reality, in comparison, very, very small, minuscule part of that much, much larger whole. But I think the reason maybe that little story, and it is, you know, truthfully a little story, Reason it might resonate is because it's a human story. It's about one poor, dispossessed people, which certainly the Choctaw were in Black 47, reaching out across great distance to help another poor, dispossessed people, actually in extreme situations, much poorer, much worse off than they were, and you know, two people like that being on the edge or the extreme of living, being able to have this bond forged so long ago and still remember to this day, it must have a transcendent quality, kind of a human. It's at the end of the day, I think, a very human story.
The workhouse, every poor law union had its own workhouse. There was 130 poor law unions in Ireland, and Skibbereen was just one of those. They were a generic design. There was different types according to the size, but they were generic design. This is the Skibbereen workhouse plan. Unfortunately, all that's left of the workhouse now, because it was burnt down in the 1920s. But when you went in as a family, the idea behind it again is that you didn't go into the workhouse to have life easier than it was outside. So they had to make conditions so unfriendly in there that you had to be desperate to go in there, more or less. So when you went in, you had a fumigation room and your clothes were taken off you, but you were segregated. You had girls, boys, men and women, and they all had their own yards. So if you went in as a family, you were separated, and you were not allowed to see the other members of your family. Again, they were made deliberately unfriendly. And you had this beautifully named ward for idiots and lunatics up here at the back. And they usually had an infirmary attached to them as well. Like I say, a generic design. This one was built in 1841 to take 800 people. At the height of the famine, it took 2,800 people. And if you think when the main cause of death through the famine was disease, they were in such close proximity and the human louse was the vector, it was just literally flying around between people. And we did this square on the floor here to represent the space. Any children that complain about their bedroom space, you normally put them standing in here, but this is 2 square feet of space, and this is the amount of space that people had to live in 24 hours a day. And again, if you think what the person next to you has typhus, dysentery, you know, it was literally a breeding ground for disease.
There was a lot more to the famine than just hunger or starvation. Now, a certain percentage of people did die from hunger or from starvation, but far and away, the mass of people died from disease. And there were various forms of diseases that were rampant during the Great Famine. Fever, typhus fever, relapsing fever, typhoid fever. Also, diseases like dysentery and diarrhea, which really are linked with shortage of food or incorrect types of foods being consumed. There were other diseases as well, like tuberculosis, measles among children, influenza, smallpox, Asiatic cholera, which appeared in 1848 and lasted throughout 1849. So all of these diseases would have been the bigger killers, rather than just simple starvation. Many of these diseases had colour associations. Typhus fever was often known as the black fever because of the black spots that covered the body. Relapsing fever was frequently accompanied by jaundice, so the body turned yellow. Asiatic cholera was often associated with bodies turning blue. The disease certainly generated fear, it generated panic. So many individuals then were, I suppose, harshly treated as a result. They were quarantined, or they were isolated, or they were shunned by the population at large. It would have happened even within families, it would have happened with neighbours. Nobody was immune from disease. But people were also aware that disease didn't know any class boundaries. So everybody potentially was in danger of contracting these diseases.
From January 1847 and throughout 1848, society, as we know it, really broke down. Conditions were so bad in the workhouse. I mean, there are accounts that men were causing disturbances there so they'd get arrested, to be sent to jail or to be transported because conditions would be better. They'd be fed, you know. There was a death cart left at the workhouse every day with the dead. And in January 1847, in 1 week in the Skibbereen workhouse, there were 46 deaths recorded. And in one day, January 30th, 1847, there were 16 deaths. And if you take it that, you know, there was 46 deaths in 1 week in the workhouse in January 1847, conditions were getting worse and worse. And for every death in the workhouse, there was a multiple of that outside the workhouse, you know, because there was people just dying on the streets. The death cart would go through the town every day and collect the dead bodies, you know. I mean, society had broken down, you know. There was no, I mean, you know, most of the deaths weren't recorded at all. A lot of people, there were stories of people burying loved ones at night because they didn't want, you know, there was a stigma attached to people dying of hunger or dying of fever. So people came to graveyards, the likes of this place here, and just buried their family at night. Other people just died in ditches or, you know, were forgotten about. It was, you know, I mean, it was just horrific.
Remember what famine is and where famine happens. Famine happens in the first instance in the family. If the family doesn't have enough food. The father can't bring in the potatoes from the field, the mother can't cook them, boil them, etc. The kids can't have them, the grandparents can have them. So death happens in families. There's the question of the potato crop. Imagine coming to the first year, and then you see a luxurious crop in the ground in July. And a week or two afterwards, it's rotting. How are you going to think of the mother of the family? How is she going to provide food on the table for her family? It's not there. The father is failing his wife, is failing his children. A lot of Irish families, because they were so poor, how do you eat the potatoes? The potatoes are put in a heap on the table. May not be much of a table, but you put it in a heap. And you know, you can just put your hands in and you can take potatoes there anytime you like. Or you sit around it and you have it. That potato pile begins to shrink in size. Whose hand goes in? Who gets the food? Do you let the old people die because they're going to die soon anyway? Do you let the children die because they're taking food from adults? Or they're weak anyway? Who makes those decisions? How far are they conscious decisions? We know that in fact there are a disproportionate number of the oldest and the youngest to die. But how far are they the result of conscious decisions? How far are they simply the way things happen in those circumstances? You're watching death creeping up on you all the time within those hovels.
Anthropologists would see three distinct phases in famine itself. And they would name the first one alarm reaction. And then there's a second stage, a resistance stage, and finally an exhaustion stage. Now this alarm reaction coincides with the beginning of famine. And as its name suggests, it was a period of alarm. People were fearful, they were afraid. It's really marked, I suppose, by a communal response to what is happening, to a cooperative generosity, people sharing food with friends and neighbours, a huge amount of activity as people are moving about looking for food, looking for relief. Also outbreaks of violence, and very often these outbreaks are occurring where food is either being stored or where it's being transported. So that basically is the opening, the alarm phase. And this then is followed by a really protracted, drawn-out phase of resistance, basically where people are trying to resist what's going on. And the essential feature here is the disappearance of this communal generosity that marked the first phase of famine. And the focus really shifts from the community, from society, onto family units. And basically, food preparation and the consumption of food is done in secret. Whatever food is available is hidden. So generosity is very quickly disappearing. Families really are looking after themselves. During this phase also, the search for alternative food supplies becomes increasingly desperate. And we've people resorting to what were the classic famine foods. People eating grass, weeds, berries, leaves, people drawing blood from cattle and consuming that. Items really which had no nutritional value. People scavenging along shorelines, along hedgerows, fields and ditches, more or less eating anything that they can lay their hands on. And finally then, this phase of resistance gives way to exhaustion. And really what this means is social collapse. The family unit collapses. All that now matters is the survival of the individual. So individual survival becomes paramount at this stage. And what we see happening is an increase in homicide, infanticide, the abandonment of children. All of these really are indicative of social disintegration, social collapse. And this really marks the most extreme phase of famine. And I think it's likely that in the more extremely affected parts of Ireland, in Skibbereen, in Schull, in places like this, by the summer of 1847, that this exhaustion phase is very marked.
This is Aberstrewery Cemetery beside Skibbereen, County Cork, famous for the fact that it holds the famine burial pit in which something like 8,000, perhaps more, people were interred without coffins. Occasionally they used a hinged coffin. In modern parlance that would be a recycled coffin. So they were laid here, and a long time passed, 40 years, all of 40 years, and this was the first memorial erected to them. Naturally, there are no names. The response to the fact that there is such a pit, the response was one of denial for decades of my life. Not until the mid-1990s was it properly looked after. It was respected, yes, but avoided. Yes, that was universal. That was the attitude. It is kept nicely now. The grass is mown quite often and is popular with many visitors to the site. Be the green grass above me, with clouds and dewdrops wet, and if thou wilt remember, and if thou wilt forget.
Yeah, we were very, very happy to put up a panel to Dr. Dan Donovan, one of the heroes of the famine in Skibbereen. We were very, very lucky to have him. This man single-handedly saved the lives of thousands of people. He was the dispensary doctor in Skibbereen at the time, but he was exceptional. He was very far ahead of his time. In actual fact, he was the first person to differentiate between death by starvation and death by disease, which seems very obvious now, but not at the time. What he did is he wrote a diary of a dispensary doctor, which was published in a newspaper, the Southern Reporter. And then this newspaper was excerpts from that report were taken by the Illustrated London News and so on. But also people read his reports, and then when people came to Ireland looking to see what the famine was like, a lot of them came to Skibbereen because of this man's writing. And obviously the more people that came, the more that was written about it, especially early in the famine, and therefore Skibbereen became synonymous with the famine. Skibbereen became the place to go.